Hello, welcome back. There seems to have been a shift in the world's sacred texts that took place a couple centuries after the arrival of Christianity. At a time when the New Testament canon was still being sorted out, a Persian prophet named Mani, and he lived from about 216 to 276 of the Common Era, Mani proclaimed that he had been called to complete the partial revelations that God had entrusted to Zoroaster, to the Buddha, and to Jesus. The religion of Manichaeism offered a dualistic vision in which the spiritual forces of light were in conflict with the evils of the material world, and salvation could come through knowledge of one's true self and knowledge of the divine. Although Manichaeism has since died out, the faith flourished between the 3rd and the 8th centuries, spreading west to the Roman Empire and east to China. At one point, Manichaeism looked like a serious rival to Christianity, and St. Augustine, the great Christian theologian of the 4th century, was a follower of Mani for 9 years before his conversion to the Christian faith. What's interesting in the context of this course is Mani's claim that his religion was superior to those of previous eras because, unlike Zoroaster or Buddha or Jesus, Mani had written down and collected his revelations personally rather than leaving that task to his disciples. The 7 scriptures of Manichaeism have since been lost and are now known only through fragments or quotations in other sources. But in subsequent centuries, there was a feeling that every religion needed to have its own sacred book, preferably composed by its founder. Thus, Muhammad's revelations were put into book form within 20 years of his death, unlike the 3 centuries that it took Christianity to finalize the New Testament. Muhammad is coming after Manichaeism. That move from revelation to canon has been even faster in more recent religions. For instance, Joseph Smith started his preaching career with the publication of the Book of Mormon in 1830. Nakayama Miki, the founder of Tenrikyo, put together a collection of her revelations in 1882 that circulated among her followers while she was still alive. And Baha'u'llah dictated the Baha'i scriptures to scribes, and then he edited them personally and began to publish them during his lifetime in the late 19th century. But the New Testament is still an old-style sacred text. It's not a revelation to Jesus. It consists of writings about Jesus, composed by his followers many years after his death. And although the religion is centered on a person who was thought to be the savior of the world, all that we know of that person's life comes through other people's reports, written in a language that he did not speak. Perhaps even more surprisingly, we don't have a single authoritative account of Jesus' life. Instead, we have 4 accounts of equal authority which don't always agree with each other. How did that happen, and what do they say? We'll start with a quick overview. The 4 Gospels have traditionally been ordered Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which is the way one encounters them in the New Testament. Matthew was the most popular gospel in the early church, and it also has the most connections to Jewish scriptures, including about a dozen fulfillment citations. That is, passages in which something that Jesus did, such as being born in Bethlehem to a virgin or teaching in parables, is said to fulfill something that had been said by one of the Hebrew prophets many centuries earlier. There are also discussions of how Jesus, far from being a radical critic of Judaism, actually fulfilled the law of Moses. Matthew begins with Jesus' genealogy and birth, and then he skips nearly 3 decades to his baptism by John the Baptist. This is followed by a series of short narratives of healings, exorcisms, confrontations with religious authorities, and miracles like the feeding of 5,000 people with just a few loaves of bread and fishes, or the story of Jesus walking on the water. There are also teaching episodes, such as the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5 through 7, that include the Beatitudes, like blessed are the peacemakers and so forth. It includes the Lord's Prayer and famous sayings like love your enemies and do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Jesus tells a number of parables or didactic stories, and he preaches about the coming of the kingdom of heaven. These narrative bits, or units, called pericopes, are mostly independent of each other. Actually, the word pericope is one of the most fun words in the English language. You should say it a couple of times. So in these pericopes, they're anecdotes without a lot of chronological connections. So they could easily be rearranged and no one would notice the difference. It was hard to construct a type biography from them because it's not exactly clear what happened when, what the exact sequence was. In fact, the four Gospels are not really like modern biographies since they don't try to recount Jesus' life in exact detail from the beginning to the end. Rather, they offer a few characteristic acts or sayings of Jesus to give readers a sense of the man. Yet on closer inspection, the narratives in the Gospel of Matthew are not exactly in random order. The stories of Jesus' preaching, as opposed to his actions, are grouped in 5 sections, the first of which is the Sermon on the Mount. Many scholars have suggested that this isn't coincidental. So Matthew may have organized Jesus' major sayings into 5 separate discourses that are reminiscent of the 5 books of Moses. In other words, the basic structure of the Gospel of Matthew presents Jesus as a new lawgiver, as one who's going to replace or supplement what was given to Moses. The Gospel of Matthew ends with an account of the Last Supper, with Jesus' arrest and crucifixion and burial, and then his resurrection. Turning now to Mark, with the opening of the Gospel of Mark, it's clear that something new is happening. Mark, using political and theological terms of the time, proclaims, this is a quotation, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The word gospel means good news, and Jesus Christ isn't exactly a name. The word Christ is the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew term Messiah, or the Anointed One. So the latest edition of the New International Version has the beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. But even though Jesus' identity is made clear to readers from the very beginning of Mark's Gospel, those who are around Jesus during his lifetime don't seem to realize who he is, in part because Jesus keeps telling those who figure out that he's the promised Messiah not to tell anyone else. Mark uses many of the same stories and sayings that we saw in Matthew, but he constructs a portrait of Jesus as a suffering Messiah, which is not exactly what people of the time had expected. The Gospel of Mark seems truncated compared to Matthew. It's shorter, and it begins with Jesus' baptism instead of his birth. It also ends rather abruptly. There's an account of the Last Supper, followed by Jesus' arrest, crucifixion, and burial, and then it tells how Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome went to the tomb after 3 days and saw that it was empty. A man in white appeared, this is according to the Gospel of Mark, a man in white appeared telling them that Jesus had been resurrected and instructing them to go tell Peter and the other disciples. And then the earliest and most reliable manuscripts, including the 4th century codices Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, end with these words. So they, this is the women, went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The end. Okay, that is a very unsatisfying ending. There are no resurrection appearances, and the women must have said something to someone. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the story of the man in white at the tomb, right? A longer ending of 10 additional verses was added to the text later, but scholars are unsure whether there was an original conclusion that somehow was lost very early on, or whether Mark had intended to leave his readers hanging there at the empty tomb, wondering themselves what had happened to Jesus. There's a good chance that the short ending was deliberate. Like Matthew, the Gospel of Mark is not a biography that simply tells about Jesus. It's an invitation to readers to believe. The question is, now that you know about Jesus' identity as the Messiah, as the Son of God, are you going to be like his disciples who abandoned him to the Roman authorities and the women who fled in terror, saying nothing? Or are you going to join Mark in proclaiming the good news? The Gospels ask, what do you think about Jesus? Or they're designed to provoke that question. What do you think about Jesus? Now, turning to the Gospel of Luke, the Greek style here is much smoother and more refined. Here's how the Gospel begins. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Okay, that is all one sentence in Greek, which shows a rather sophisticated command of the language. That's one of the characteristics of Greek, is you can make these long sentences, called the periodic style. Note that Luke doesn't claim to be an eyewitness himself. He's putting together his account from earlier sources. And although he's addressing someone named Theophilus, who may have been a specific individual, or perhaps any Christian reader, the name Theophilus means the lover of God. Even though he addresses someone specifically, the author never specifically identifies himself as Luke. In fact, none of the earliest manuscripts of any of the four Gospels indicate who wrote them. We today refer to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John for convenience, but these names were attached to those four Gospels in the 2nd century, along with very specific biographies. So it's said that Matthew was an early disciple who was a tax collector. Mark was an associate of the Apostle Peter. Luke was supposed to have been a physician and a traveling companion of Paul, while John was one of the apostles. But in their original form, the Gospels are anonymous. Luke starts with the birth of John the Baptist, followed by the angel's annunciation to Mary that she would be a virgin mother. We learn of Jesus' birth, and then there's just one story from his growing up years, about the time when he was lost in Jerusalem at the age of 12 and ended up in the temple where his parents eventually found him. So just that one story, and then the Gospel of Luke moves on to Jesus' ministry when he turned 30, beginning with his baptism by John. Luke provides Jesus' genealogy after his baptism, rather than before his birth, and it actually doesn't match up with the one in Matthew. Once again, in Luke, we get stories of healings and exorcisms, parables, moral teachings, and debates with religious authorities, many of which we've already seen in Matthew and Mark, though in a different order and with some subtle variations. Luke gives more attention to women, to prayer, the Holy Spirit, and some of the disreputable elements of society, people like tax collectors and the poor and Samaritans. Samaritans were a marginalized group of Jews, tracing their ancestry back to people who had remained in the land after the conquest of Israel by the Assyrians in 722 BCE. For instance, Luke is the only gospel that tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, who aided a traveler in distress when a priest and a Levite would not, even though those people would be expected to be moral examples or good examples of religious living. The juxtaposition between the word good and Samaritan would have come as a shock to those who first heard Jesus tell this story. There was a lot of prejudice against Samaritans. It would be like hearing an account today in a very conservative church in which the hero of the story, who showed true Christian kindness, turned out to be a drug addict or a lesbian couple or an atheist professor. Like the other Gospels, Luke concludes with the passion narrative of Jesus' death and his resurrection. The first three Gospels are often called the Synoptic Gospels, from a Greek word that means seen together. The idea is that those three Gospels have so much in common that you could line them up into three parallel columns and read them with a single glance. The Gospel of John, however, is very different. Rather than short, independent episodes, those pericopes, it features lengthy discourses in which Jesus, far from trying to hide his identity, openly proclaims his divine status. His words are often cryptic to outsiders, as when he speaks about being born again, or when he declares, "I am the bread of life come down from heaven." But those in the know understand the significance of his words. There are only a few stories in John, apart from the Passion narrative, that appear in the other Gospels. John has no exorcisms, no parables, and no proclamations of the coming kingdom of heaven. Jesus' ministry in the fourth Gospel spans several years with multiple trips to Jerusalem. And the Last Supper is not the Passover meal, all of which are quite different from the Synoptic Gospels. John is often considered the most spiritual or even mystical of the four Gospels. And you can see why from its very first words, which begin not with Jesus' birth or his baptism, but with his primordial existence as God in heaven. The Gospel of John starts, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things came into being. Not one thing came into being except through him. What has come into being in him was life, life that was the light of men. And light shines in darkness, and darkness could not overpower it." It's that Word in the beginning that eventually will become Jesus Christ. The Gospel of John is organized into two parts. Chapters 1 through 12 make up the book of signs. That is, miracles demonstrating that Jesus is the Messiah, or even God himself in human form. And then the second part of the Gospel of John are chapters 13 and 20, which are the book of glory, in which Jesus fulfills his divine destiny through his death and resurrection. Strikingly, chapters 13 through 19 all take place within a single 24-hour period. John ends with an epilogue, chapter 21, that contains stories about Peter and the risen Lord, with a note that this gospel was written by the beloved disciple who goes unnamed. Remember, it's only later on that we're going to identify that disciple as John. So there you have it. Three gospels that are rather similar, and then John. Altogether, 4 accounts of the life of Jesus. Since the 2nd century, Christians have wanted to weave these together into a single harmonious record of Jesus' words and deeds that smoothed over or omitted some of the discrepancies. The first attempt was by an early Christian named Tatian in about 170 CE, and his book was called the Diatessaron, or it means made from 4. But it really can't be done. There are just too many differences and out-and-out contradictions between those 4 Gospels. So the church ended up sticking with 4 distinct Gospels, though even today, Christmas pageants have to blend together details from different Gospels. The 3 wise men and the star appear only in Matthew. The shepherds, the angel, and the manger are only in Luke. The last 2 centuries or so have seen the rise of the historical critical method in biblical studies. The term critical here doesn't mean criticizing or finding fault. Rather, it's derived from the Greek word kritikos, able to discern or skilled in making judgments. The idea is that scholars try to read the text as carefully as possible and then come to their own reasoned conclusions without relying on tradition or theology. The goal in such an approach is to make observations and provide explanations that people from different religious perspectives or even no religion might agree upon. In an earlier lecture, we saw an example of source criticism when scholars analyzed the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, to identify the different traditions behind it and how they were put together. One of the major puzzles in New Testament source criticism is the relationship between the 3 synoptic Gospels. The wording is often so similar that it's obvious that some of the Gospel writers were copying from each other. Yet there are also significant differences between the 3 Gospels. This can most easily be seen in a synopsis of the Gospels. That is an edition of the Gospels that lines up the 3 accounts side by side in parallel. Scholars, of course, studied the Greek originals, and based on a detailed analysis of their wording and sequence and characteristic changes that are made from one to the other, the most widely accepted solution to the so-called synoptic problem is the 2-source hypothesis. The synoptic problem is that issue of, so how exactly are these Gospels related to each other? Most scholars now believe that Mark was written first, and then Matthew and Luke independently produced revised versions of Mark, omitting some details and stories and adding others. That's the first source in the 2-source solution. The second source is a hypothetical collection of Jesus' sayings called Q, and that's short for the German word Quelle, or source. This would explain why the material from that Matthew and Luke have in common that's not in Mark nearly always consists of sayings rather than stories. They're just quotations mostly, not events that Jesus took part in. Somewhat confusingly, some scholars identified the material unique to Matthew and the material unique to Luke as two additional sources called M and L. So they also talk about the four-source hypothesis, but it's virtually the same as the two-source hypothesis. So Matthew and Luke used Mark and Q to put together their Gospels. After a consensus was reached about sources, scholars began to analyze exactly what changes Matthew and Luke had made to the Gospel of Mark and to speculate on the theological motivations behind those editorial choices. This approach to the New Testament is called redaction criticism. We can get a sense of it by looking at a story that's included in all three synoptic Gospels, Jesus' baptism. This episode would have been a little troubling to early Christians since it seems to indicate that Jesus was a follower of John's, when Christian doctrine insisted that Jesus was actually the superior figure. Mark begins with John the Baptist baptizing those who come to him and confess their sins. Jesus is baptized by John, and then the gospel reports that a voice came from heaven saying, "You are my son, my beloved. With you I am well pleased." When Matthew retells that story, he adds a conversation in which John at first refuses to baptize Jesus, saying, "I need to be baptized by you." Eventually, John is going to consent, but after he does so, a voice comes from heaven saying, "This is my son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." Did you catch that in Mark, the heavenly voice speaks to Jesus as a sort of personal affirmation, while in Matthew, the voice addresses the crowd and talks about Jesus? Remember that in Mark, Jesus' true identity is hidden from the crowds, so that difference sort of makes sense. When it comes to Luke's gospel, he keeps Mark's version of the voice from heaven speaking to Jesus, but he reports that this happened after Jesus had been baptized while he was praying. Remember that prayer is one of Luke's characteristic themes. He tries to work that into stories regularly. Even more strikingly, Luke first tells the story of how John the Baptist was imprisoned by King Herod, and that's going to be, so that he's going to mention that imprisonment in chapter 3, verse 20, before he turns his attention to Jesus' baptism in verse 21, which is a little strange because you have John in prison before Jesus is baptized. The Gospel of Luke never specifically says that John was the one who did the baptizing, but by shifting around the chronology, Luke makes it clear that John's ministry came to a decisive conclusion and then was superseded by Jesus' authority. We'll conclude this lecture by looking at one more book in the New Testament. After the four Gospels, the next book is Acts. It's basically an account of the early Christian community after Jesus' resurrection, and it tells of missionary efforts and the founding of the church. But Acts is not exactly an independent work. It's addressed to Theophilus, just as Luke was, and it appears to be a sequel to Luke's Gospel, written by the same originally anonymous Christian writer. One mystery that remains unsolved is that although most of the book of Acts is written in the third-person voice, right? He did this or they did that, there are 4 passages which range from 8 to 60 verses where the narrator shifts into the first-person plural. So we see that first happening when all of a sudden the gospel will say, "When Paul had seen the vision, we immediately tried to cross over into Macedonia." Okay, who's the we? And we immediately tried to cross over. Acts begins with the resurrected Jesus being taken up to heaven, followed by the descent of the Holy Spirit upon his disciples at the Jewish festival of Pentecost. Okay, the Spirit is manifest in their spontaneous ability to speak in tongues or in foreign languages. Then follows stories of miraculous healings, the proclamations of the Christian gospel, and persecutions mostly focused on the Apostle Peter. During the stoning of the first Christian martyr, Stephen, we hear of a young anti-Christian zealot who held the coats of those throwing stones. This was Saul, who a few chapters later will see the resurrected Jesus in vision and convert to Christianity himself, and then is renamed Paul. Peter has a revelation directing him to take Christianity not just to the Jews, but also to non-Jews, to Gentiles. And then the second half of the book of Acts focuses on Paul, who does just that. Paul goes on 3 missionary journeys through Palestine, Asia Minor, which is present-day Turkey, and Greece. Everywhere he goes, preaching of Jesus, making converts, and establishing local congregations. Finally, Paul is arrested at Jerusalem, and when he appeals the charges, he's sent to Rome for trial. The book of Acts ends with Paul in the capital city of the empire, under house arrest, but preaching the gospel freely. One of the main themes in the book of Acts is relations between Christians and Jews. A crucial question is whether Christianity is a sect of Judaism or whether it's more of a new, independent religion. Okay, remember that in the first generations, Jews and Christians shared the same scriptures, the Septuagint, and many of the same beliefs. But in this case, it's a religious practice. It's religious practices that make the crucial difference. Some early Christians felt that belief in Jesus was an add-on to Judaism. That is to say, when Gentiles were converted to the Christian gospel, they needed to keep all the requirements of the laws of Moses, kosher food, moral principles, regulations for worship, and circumcision. Others, like Paul, argued that the hundreds of rules in the Torah had been superseded by Christ, and that Gentile converts could worship Jesus without first becoming Jews and changing everything about their customs and their lifestyles. In the end, the issue was decided by a council in Jerusalem. Acts chapter 15 speaks of a gathering of apostles and elders who were debating the matter at some length. Peter told of his revelation that the gospel should go to the Gentiles, and Paul shared stories of his success among them. Finally, James put forward a compromise position that was accepted by all. He said Gentiles could become Christian if they kept only 4 of the Mosaic laws. And these were to abstain from, first, food that had been offered to idols, second, abstain from blood, third, abstain from the meat of animals that had been strangled, and fourth, abstain from fornication. Okay, for listeners to this lecture who may be Christian, how many of those prohibitions have you heard in church lately? Actually, the one about abstaining from blood, I think, is the origin of the desire of Jehovah's Witnesses not to have anything to do with blood transfusions. They read Acts 15 actually very, very literally. In one of Paul's letters, he said that Peter had been made an apostle to the Jews while he, Paul, had been sent to the Gentiles. It says that in Galatians. The rest of Acts follows Paul in his missionary endeavors, and indeed Paul was the most successful of the early Christian missionaries. In the next chapter, we'll look more closely at Paul and the Gentile mission, according to his own letters, as well as the remaining writings in the New Testament. We'll take it all up there. And then we'll ask the question of how this particular collection of 27 documents, which so obviously came from the minds and pens of human beings, could nevertheless be considered a repository of eternal truths.